Thanks everyone for having me and us at Nikai Theater. Um, I'm Jacob Zimmer. I'm the artistic director at Nikai. We're located on the territory of the Kwanlin Dun and the Tanquachin Council in the Yukon Territory, which has self-governing agreements with 11 of our 14 First Nations in the territory. Uh, I came to this one with these desire to think about tech in a low bandwidth place because we live in that reality, and there's so much of this world that I get excited by. But also when people say, stream this on your new iPhone, I'm like, okay, we've got to work out some things. But I also came with this an idea for a game that would be called Future Histories, and it's a fable, and it's 3 to 6 players get together with their smartphones, and a world sort of appears before them, shared between their smartphones. These are very rough concept sketches I've made. There would be real animators used. So the 3 to 6 players would come together, and on their phones they would have a bit of a shared reality, but also a separate reality. So they might be receiving instructions that were different from each other via audio or text. And that the game function in the activity would involve them moving around and adjusting their position in whatever play space they had, and that positionality of the phones and the performers would be the sort of unlocking mechanism or create some win conditions. This also had a really strong belief inherent in it that I wanted to do, that we wanted to do some future fables, that we wanted to talk about the future in a way that's sort of different from how it's mostly talked about in gaming especially, but also just generally in narrative. We do a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff that is just sort of used to further a sort of all against all story. And that's not the only story. And potentially because we've been telling that story, we end up with an all against all world. And so who showed up from the group? Ryan, Tara, Kat, and Aiden joined in this hack, and it was really great. We ended up, because we have from Berlin to Pacific time, and a bunch of spots in between, we ended up working quite separately from each other. But we had an amazing original conversation. And then continue to do some work separately, and I want to say thank you to those folks for showing up and really helping this project. One of the things we realized quite early, and was probably always true, is that we're sort of waiting for the phone technology to catch up with my weird idea of Twister meets Fables. And so the sort of the phone world of the phones knowing where each other are in space and all of those things it's not quite there. I want to say thank you to the mentors. I had some great sort of offline and side conversations about even the terms to use when asking people about how this technology might work. And that's really useful because I and the rest of this team in this circumstance are coming from the sort of purely imaginative space. It's great to run into folks who actually know what they're talking about. But we decided if we couldn't work on the phone tech, that we would work on the story tech, because this question of how to adapt fables into a game, I've been saying that probably for about a year, but never actually taken any shots at doing it, or even thinking about how we would communicate that with each other. So we talked about a bunch of things at the beginning. We talked a lot about the fables and the use of animals, and this idea that whatever the story was would be narrated by an animal from the future who has sent back this game as a subtle training manual for the future, so that humans playing this game will be better prepared for the future that is to come. and that the fables would somehow encourage that behavior. So we're increasing collaboration, we're increasing play, we're increasing sort of nonverbal literacy. There's a lot of play in this stuff that is part of it. So like it's kind of like charades. We also talked about, this is very inspired by a game called Space Team by a Montreal game designer, which is called, it's a collaborative shouting game. But it was the first game that gave me it only works if everybody's in the same room. And it was a real opening for me for what might be fun with a cell phone. Because then the performance is in the game itself. And we also talked about seasons and animals. And as we got to talk about animals, we talked about, if, in thinking about what a better world might look like, that one of the things that was probably going to need to go away was the human tendency to think that we are not part of nature, to think about like, oh, we need to improve the relationship between nature and humans, as if those were two separate things. And so that became a sort of a spark that led us to seasons and to cycles and to those stories and how animals cooperate. So we sort of reduced down to the fable game. And we started that with saying, okay, everyone pick an animal. And these are the animals people picked. We had ducks from Minnesota who also go to Canada. They have summer homes in Canada. Ryan looked into wolves and the Yukon wolves. I did a bit of looking to foxes, which both are home in my where I was born in Cape Breton, but also are very present in Whitehorse and in the Yukon. Foxes are kind of like our raccoons for Torontoites. Like they're just in the city all the time, and I walk home and I'm like, hey dude, how you doing? Yeah. So they're around, and I'm interested in the animals that deal a bit with humans. Kat was interested in muskox, which are pretty amazing beasts. Aiden took a look into the goats that live in the Yukon. And so we looked at these and what their seasons were, and thinking also about gestures and beginning to think about these things that we don't really have a way to play. And I don't know if people can see my video, but like that how, if we're talking about the goats, how do we get, a bunch of players to put their hands up by their heads and sort of move towards each other and back, right? Like how might that be an encouraged thing to do? And so we looked at all these animals and some of their gestures and thinking about movements that we could create. I went down a particular rabbit hole of the fox and the hedgehog, where this story that is actually in there's old fables, and then there's Isaiah Berlin wrote a book, or a very short thing that he says was sort of a joke and now has been taken quite seriously by tech thought leaders, quote unquote, especially, but that the fox is the like generalist who has many ideas, and the hedgehog only has one idea but is very good at it. And this tension between the single focus deep work and the like open space wanderer got me really interested. I think in part because as I went down rabbit holes, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm a fox, okay, like how do we, and that maybe the future is actually in the collaboration and cooperation between foxes and hedgehogs, and how those animals might work together. So I prompted folks to start thinking about their animals sort of on a spectrum of fox and hedgehog, and to be thinking about how we might move past some of these either ors also. And so we don't really have much to sort of present in a presenting way. This is an example of some of the draft that Tara made in the Google Docs. So we ended up with a bunch of different Google Docs that I would bounce between and other people would bounce between. And that really started with this Edward the Duck and Steve the Fox, taking these stories and moving them into the duck telling a fable that is about a duck, but the duck has an opinion about the fable and is trying to teach something. We also talked about the ways that fables are always about the time that they're written as much as they're about ducks and foxes. So in this one, for example, Tara and I were bouncing back and forth on issues of displacement and gentrification, of misunderstood privilege, right? That the duck is like, why can't everybody float on water? What's the problem with flooding? And the fox has a problem with flooding because the barrows. Like, so we have these stories are adaptable, and that's one of the things that I really loved. And also in these moments, we had a moment of, how do we introduce the duck, do some basic flocking, right? Can we get people to all stand in a corner of a room? How do they move around? And yeah, and so we were just doing these prompts and getting towards a way that the stories work. And I want to thank the group for, I'm often an executive dramaturge. Like I come in with an idea, I don't know how to write the scene, but if there's something, then I can work with it. So I'm really deeply grateful for these folks who joined in and created some things that then I could see, and there were some just great ideas. The migrating, getting people to like all of this, how to take up the space really opened up for me in this storytelling, and then a little bit of how the fables work, and just that the hook of an instruction manual sent back from the past, from the future. Next things for us, and this is fairly quick. Is the iterative development sequence, which is play, draft, find funding, play, draft, find funding, and repeat. This project I want to keep open with these people and these stories. It's also a thing where we want to commission stories from storytellers and writers in the Yukon, with some focus particularly on First Nation authors. We very intentionally stayed in sort of AESOP and European traditions, because that's the tradition that we all in the group came from. And one of the things that maybe the animals will teach us is we shouldn't retell other people's stories or mess around too much with that, or at least have a connection to those stories. So that's a big part of this, is starting to commission some new fables and some fables that emerge out of other than AESOP and Grimm's, although those are also really interesting. And of course, the world of what is the digital creation and how does that go on phones and how is that created, becomes a question, of course, and how to create those things. But also there's moments of this morning of looking at things where I'm going like, oh, this is maybe just a really fun tabletop role-playing game that doesn't need, like, the phones are not helpful, or how, what, maybe it's less about there being lots of digital content and more about just using the sensors and the phones and the cameras working, and it not being so much about the creation. And that kind of came up from this, and I think I said on Wednesday, I love when hackathons end up with non-tech results, even if I feel a little bad presenting and not being like, we made a cool app. But yeah, we're working on stories, and so maybe it goes a little slower. This is a giant sloth, which is ish, which lived in the Yukon a couple ice ages ago. So we're continuing to work on that. Thank you for everyone. This is a project that we'll be developing, and so any thoughts, prompts, places to look for funding, or solving of technical problems is super welcome. You can reach me at all those places. Yeah, and again, if anyone else, Tara, I know you're on the call, like if there's anyone else who wants to speak to things that came up to them while working on their part, that would be great. Other than that, I think that's it for me.
Ha 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 ha!